Sorry, got to back up to go forward. Again, to go into inactive status, you use that form, you prove your give them proof of your ERP coverage. And to come back out, you have to, now here's the part, you have to affiliate, of course, and to come back out after January 1 of next year anyway, you don't have to do it yet, but after January 1 of next year, if you haven't taken the core course in 4 years, you'll have to take the core course. And if you were inactive more than one education cycle, so more than one education year, you'll also have to take 6 hours of continuing ed in addition to the core course. And that 6 hours have to be from a list approved by the KREC. I'm not sure what they're going to have on there. I'm sure things like the new regulations would be one of them. But if you've got anybody, friend, colleague, whoever, who's in inactive status and is considering getting out of inactive status, I guess it's against my interest to say so, but I'll tell you, you ought to go ahead and tell them, go ahead and do it before January 1, because after January 1, you're going to have to go through all this education makeup. And if you do it before then, you don't have to go through the made up education. So speaking of which, based on that last question, I'll also say brokers, here's another place where you not only could have, but I encourage you to have higher standards about continuing education perhaps than the KREC has. Because even though the KREC says you can come out of escrow before January 1 without any continuing ed, you could have somebody who's laid in escrow for 10 or 15 or 20 years, and they could come out of escrow and not have any continuing education as it stands right now. I wouldn't want that person practicing for me if I was a broker. I would want them to at least take the core class. At a very minimum. Think how much the law has changed in that time. And I've got another chat here. Let's see. Great question. How can a principal broker and an associate broker change roles within a firm? Does the status of listings change? That's a really good question. The simple answer is the old associate broker becomes the principal broker and the principal becomes the associate. That's the easy answer by just sending the two forms in simultaneously. The status of the listings would in fact change because the listings actually are the property of the principal broker. But it does say they're the property of the principal broker, barring a written agreement otherwise. So you could have a written agreement between the two of you about, I don't know if there's going to be money flow around this or not, but you could certainly have a written agreement about who's going to become the owner of those once the brokerage, the principal broker status changes. That's a really good question. And there's actually a regulation or policy in any event in effect with the KREC about that, where you have this momentary gap period where one's gone and then the other one's there, because you're actually only allowed to have one principal broker at a time in a firm. The grandfather status is still there, so people who were licensed before, I think it's June 19 of 1976, if I remember that date, are excluded from the requirements to have any education whatsoever. Isn't that frightening? But and if they are and they're rolling out of inactive status, they still don't have to have any education. Isn't that even more scary? And here's again a place where I would encourage you that are brokers. You could have a higher standard for education than the KREC has. And you certainly could say, I don't care what the license law says about this education thing. If you're going to work for me, you're going to have education. grandfathered or not. I don't want people bouncing around my firm who don't know anything about the law. Since 1976, I had hair in 1976, Norm. Can you believe that? That's how long that's been. Yeah, yeah. What kind of crazy world is that? Okay. Oh, there it is, June 19. I did have it right. 1976, those folks are technically exempt, but everybody else has the 6 hours every 2 years with that banking requirement we talked about. Again, we've got that reporting has to be by midnight on December 31st, so don't forget that and don't get caught up short. Obviously, you all are golden for this year because you're taking a 6-hour class in May. Here that I definitely wanted you to know, again, I'll say to you brokers, because you've got people under you, people who don't get their license, their continuing education done now, they have to, before the deadline, excuse me, come up with a plan by which they're going to do it. You used to have until February 10 to even come up with the plan. Well, now you're required to have the plan before December 31st. You can't count pre-license classes as mandatory continuing ed. And another one, it's hard to believe anybody would want to, but you can't take more than 9 hours of continuing education in any calendar day. I would go insane if I had tried to take more than 9 hours in a day, but I guess some people have, and so they've limited that. And of course, you got to be here more, you can't be 10 minutes later. We don't have any choice but to keep you out because you don't get credit. And same thing is true for core. If it's your year to take a core, which is every 4 years from when you're licensed, then the same rules apply to that. People who get a reciprocal license in the last 3 months of an education cycle, they do get a pass for the last 3 months. They don't have to take another year's worth. But that only makes sense. They just got through taking 6 academic credit hours worth of education. So they get a 3-month pass if they do that. And so the KREC can grant extensions to continuing education compliance for people who have true hardships, and including active military duty, licensees or their immediate relative having extensive, notice it says extensive medical issues. Obviously you all are here not worrying about that, but encourage your licensees not to wait around till the end and think they're going to get an extension, because the KREC has gotten really tough about this. And again, the request has to be received before the last day of the month or year in which the education is due. So for most people, that would mean December 31st. The PLE people is when it would be some other month. But you have to ask for the extension ahead of time. It's not canceled while they're considering their hardship request, but they might deny it. And if there's a delinquency notice, then you've got a short time to get it done. If you don't get your CE done or get a delinquency plan in place, the license is canceled automatically, and that is different than what the law used to be. You used to go through this long, drawn-out process with hearings and everything else, and people regularly drug this out into June before they even had a problem, really, and now it's an automatic cancellation. Also notice that the fine for any of this is now $1,000, not the old $500. So it's got some real teeth in it to not get continuing education done. Now, I will say, of course, people can roll into inactive status, but they'd have to do that before they get canceled. And if you have a delinquency plan, you've got to get it done before April 30th. And it used to be June 15th. So as you can see, they've tightened this up all over the place about getting your continuing ed done, or if you get an extension, getting it done promptly. Okay, I've got a question I don't know the answer to, and I'm going to tell you so. The question is, I recently heard that Indiana is acknowledging Kentucky continuing education hours, and you no longer have to meet Indiana's requirements. I don't know that. I do have a law license in Indiana, but I do almost no practice there, honestly, and I am not that familiar with the Indiana Real Estate Commission's regulations. I would encourage you to contact them in Indianapolis. I think it's called like KREC, and try to get them to confirm that with you one way or the other. The last I knew, Indiana's requirements were different than Kentucky's enough that they did not necessarily overlap exactly. So now they may have changed their regulation and I haven't kept up with that. So I'm sorry, I don't know that answer. We can get a little more done before our last break of the afternoon. If you roll into inactive status, this is going to sound repetitive, but it's in here twice. Then you do have to complete your mandatory education to come back out in any year. And again, if you don't get those things done, you're canceled. Not just a notice and a hearing, but you're canceled. And they do have the power, if you get a delinquency plan and don't meet it, they do have the ability to suspend you for 6 months, and during a suspension, you're not allowed to practice. And seeing how I'm doing on time and slides. Okay. And again, you'd have to pay all your fees, get all your education caught up. Being suspended would not be a good thing. And just to be clear, because there were people who at least alleged that they didn't get the deficiency notice from the KREC, the regulation makes very clear that getting a notice or not isn't their problem. Even if you didn't get it, the rules are the rules, and we're all expected to know them, and we all have to get our education on time. So yeah, there's where I wanted to get. So that was the end of that education section. It's a perfect time for us to take our last break of the afternoon. I'll see you back in 10. I'll make some noise in 9, and we'll do our last hour. And I'm going to try to mute myself and see if this works. Bink.
Hey, Norm, are you in the office? No. How did you put the background? You have to tell me about that later.
No, I'm at my house.
Okay. But this background is not really on your wall. It's digitally put on you.
No, it's I painted it on my wall.
Well, I thought.
No, it's a green screen.
Oh, okay. You have to show me how to do that.
You some people can use just a virtual background, but I've got a little bit of older computer, so I got a green screen behind me, so it's just a green curtain.
Right.
Or not curtain, but green. You can use whatever green. It just has to be a green, and you can put whatever you want behind you.
Oh, okay.
So I can put different. Now I'm the floating head.
Now you can hear me. You hear me now?
Yep.
Okay, thank you. 1 minute. Very interesting. Sorry about that, team. I hit my mechanical mute button on my computer, and it does that, and it also digitally mutes me, and I have to do it twice to get off. Very bizarre. Someday I'll figure all this out. All right, let's go. Got some faces. I got people back, and it's 3 o'clock, and we're in good shape.
As soon as you get it figured out, it'll be different.
And then it's going to, then the computer will crash, and I'll have to start over. Exactly. Then I have to start over. Let's see, just like this. There we go. All right, we're on our last hour of the day. We've got a very short segment on E&O insurance and then forms. You've had to have E&O insurance in order to have a license. Then you have to keep your E&O current. It's allowed to have some deductibles in there, some parts that you have to pay. Most coverages waive it anyhow, though. The E&O policy is allowed to have certain exclusions. There used to be a very long list of allowed exclusions. Request E&O carrier. The KREC took out that list, and instead they've said it can just be consistent with common custom in the market, which just gave them a little more flexibility, so they don't have to go back and get a regulation change every time some new bizarre regulation comes up that ends up with, or anytime a new exclusion comes up. How many people want to bet there's a COVID exclusion going to get into the policy? Show of physical hands, right? I mean, sure there will be, right? Health stuff. I mean, it's so bizarre. They can't change the reg fast enough. Okay, how was that? That's a short one. You have to have mandatory E&O insurance. The last thing I wanted to say about it that there's not really a slide for, but because you have mandatory E&O insurance, and the policy is usually written on an annual basis, but your license is off of a March 31st date, you got to make sure you got your coverage, up to date at any time, especially when you first get licensed. It may be a little tricky for you. All right, we have a whole section in here about forms. Trying to think. Yeah, let me do it this way. I've cut pieces of these forms and put them in the slideshow. If we get time, I'll go out and we'll go out into the KREC website and look at the entire forms. First of all, as of December of that's wrong, December 2019, they knew there were going to be, there are going to be changes in the forms, and so they delayed the effective date of those. Slide 362. They put delayed the effective date of the forms until June 1. Again, that's now been extended. By the way, these are not my words. These are the actual words from a KREC email, because I wanted them exactly copied because it was so bizarre, so that I was telling you exactly what their position was. So those agency forms, you don't have to use at all, but the other forms are all now effective as of June 1st. So whenever that next Monday, I guess. And again, that's because of their meeting last week, May 21st. They said, okay, we're gonna hold off on the agency forms, but the request was made to also hold off on the seller's disclosure form, and they said, no, you need to start using that seller's property disclosure form on June 1. So that's where we are. So the guide to agency relationship forms, I do have it in here. Again, this is the form you do not have to use, but I just put some things in here off that form that I thought were interesting and that were different than the form you're probably currently using, your current consumer guide to agency relationships. For one thing, it put in here the single agency statutory definition. I thought that made a lot of sense, frankly. It put in here the transactional brokerage definition. Let's see, we got a chat question. Let me pull it up. Let me try to pull it up. Well, oh, there we go. It was hiding behind you all. Oh, great question. Do you have to change forms if current listing already has an old one online? I would say the answer to that is no, because what you were required to do under the law is you were required to have a seller's property disclosure form filled out at the time of listing. So you did that sometime prior to today. You had the old form filled out. You were totally in compliance at that point. So it would only be on listings that you have from midnight Sunday on, you'll need to use the new seller's property disclosure form. That was a great question. Thank you for bringing that up. So yeah, so they included the regulatory definition of transactional brokerage, specifically told the consumer what duties are owed to people and said, hey, if you're in a transactional brokerage relationship, you're going to be owed the duty of good faith and fair dealing, and we're not going to relay confidential information, but other than that, you're on your own. They included the description of what teams are and what that means. Frankly, I thought that was all a good, I think this form is actually pretty good as far as just what it did to describe things. Again, lots of information about teams, kind of beyond the scope of what we need to do today, but just to know they're there. It did a good thing and talked about cooperation between brokerage. And I thought this was a good thing because we've known that just because you shared fees with the other broker did not mean the other broker was representing your client. We all knew that, but the clients may or may not have understood that. And so this document goes out of its way to explain that to clients so that they'll know that. We'll skip this one for now. Boy, that color isn't good, is it? Agency consent agreement. So this is, there's a buyer version and a seller version. This is the document that's meant to replace your agency disclosures. But again, this form is on an indefinite delay. There are a couple of problems with it. The biggest problem with it, I'll show you when we go to the KREC website here in just a second. One of the things it did that was different is it did add a subpart 4 that involves transactions with a non-client party. So you remember you had part 1 with only one real estate company. Part 2 was 2 different brokerages. Part 3 was a single real estate agent, and they could check off buyer, seller, none about who you were representing. Well, they added part 4 for transaction brokerage. And they actually then have the ability for you to say, hey, I'm not representing any of you. One of the problems with the form is when they did that, they did not eliminate the Part 3 none box, which is what this is meant to cover. So you either needed this or you needed the other one. This is better. So they're going to fix that. But again, you don't have to use these until they've gone through a revision process. Now, the seller's disclosure of property condition form. You do need to start using this one Monday on anything you list after Monday. This form, although it may get tweaked a little bit someday in the future, I thought was a pretty good form. Maybe that's because I had some input on it. Whoop, we got another chat question. Let me pull it up. Okay. Okay. What about the occasional or casual co-listing arrangement? Do they count as a team? And what guidelines or requirements apply? That's a great question also that comes up. Teams are meant to be permanent relationships, but you're not always in a team. Sometimes you just co-list with somebody. My understanding is a co-listing is not a team, and it is just what it sounded like, co-listing. And so there's no specific statute or regulation that deals with co-listings. You're in the same position on those that you've always been, is that you're both in effect jointly and severally liable for those. We lawyers would call that a joint venture relationship. So I think that's where you are on those co-listings. But that's a great question because that does come up almost every seminar. Sellers, whoop, gotta back up and come at it again. Seller's property disclosure form. Again, this one is mandatory. At this point, I only put into my slide particular words from there, and then we'll go back and look at the forms themselves. I wanted to point out some of the new words that were in there, is that it specifically tells us that the seller's disclosure is based on the best of their knowledge of the property they're selling. That wasn't there before, and it's meant to be clear. It was meant to give sellers, frankly, some more comfort in filling these things out, that they weren't asked to be a mind reader about what happened 30 years ago with the seller, but it's based on just what it says, the best of your knowledge of the property. And it's clear that that's however and whenever you, the seller, gained that knowledge. So all these words in here, when they talk about you, I'm really not talking to you, licensees. This is talking to sellers. And this change was made specifically to be clear to sellers, to clear up a possible point of confusion from the way the old form was worded. If you look at the current form you're using in those introductory paragraphs, you could almost hyper-technically read that to say that you did not have to disclose something you knew about the property. You gained your knowledge before you were the owner. So, 2 examples of that. I bought my neighbor's house from the little old lady next door. While she lived there, I was her chief helper, and I went over there with my shop vac every time it rained, and I helped her suck out her basement of the water. That happened before I bought the house from her. Then I bought the house. I happened to buy it in a dry spell. It did not leak during the time I owned it. We painted it, we fluffed the mulch, and we sold it. A mischievous seller could have read that old form to say that I didn't have to disclose that the basement leaked, because even though I knew it not during the time I owned the property. I know that's a convoluted statement, but that is how people could have read it and argued it before. This language here is meant to dispel that conception of a seller. and make clear that however and whenever I gained knowledge that that basement leaked, I needed to disclose it. Now, I know that my neighbor lady's basement is a pretty extreme and unusual situation, but I'll give you a situation that's not at all unusual. I'm buying a house, and as part of the purchase process, I do my own inspection before the closing, and I see that the basement leaks. I know that. I'm not the owner that day. Do I have to disclose that? Well, of course, at common law, I have to disclose it. I know it. Same thing is true whether I knew that because my eyes saw it, or because my professional home inspector's eyes saw it, or for that matter, if the seller told me about it. I know it, and therefore, at common law, I was required to disclose it. So what this really does is brings the form into compliance with what the common law about fraud is anyway, to be quite frank. But this is meant to give the seller, I'm going to say, comfort and duty. The comfort is, I'm going to back up. The comfort is it is only based on my knowledge. So if I really don't know it, then I'm not going to be held liable for it. But at the same time, if I do have knowledge, regardless of how and when I got that knowledge, I've got to make a disclosure. And I've got to just pause here for a chat question. Yeah, there you go. Heirs not trying not to disclose things they know. There's another example. I wasn't the owner of my parents' house, but I was over there with the shop vac all the time, right? And then finally they pass away. Now I'm the owner. I got to disclose that. Perfect example. Thank you, Laura. And here's the other half of that. However that knowledge was gained. So whether it was from my eyes, my home inspector's eyes, the prior seller's eyes, the prior seller's disclosure that I got, I've got that knowledge and I've got a duty to disclose it. The instructions are to answer truthfully, report all known conditions affecting the property, regardless of how I know about them or learned. And I did a bad job of the cut and paste, so this is my fault, not the drafter of the form. It's just my poor technology skills and how I could cut things. There's some new questions in here. You have told me for years, if not decades, that a lot of sellers would strike through all the unknown boxes and they would write in the margin, "I never lived in this house." How many of you have had that experience? Let me see a physical raise of hands. Now I got a bunch of faces. Yeah, right. Used to happen all the time. Clearly that was never an acceptable way to fill out this form. Let me first of all say that. But they specifically added the question of, have you lived in the house? So that when people didn't live in the house, they've got a specific place to say so. And that's fine. We'll know that they didn't live there, and I can take that for what it's worth in terms of their knowledge. I tell people when I did buy the house, also whether I own it as an individual or a company, that's new. Here's something that's new is, to the best of my knowledge, has the house been used as a rental? People find that worthwhile to know, and I understand why, both for good and bad. I've got a handful of rental houses, and I probably take better care of them than I do my own house. On the other hand, they do tend to get beat up a little bit, so it does affect it. To the best of my knowledge, has this house ever been vacant for more than, and it cut off? I think the answer there is 3 months. Sorry about that. And has it, to the best of my knowledge, has this house ever been used for anything other than a residence? So obviously those things come up and might well be relevant to somebody who's buying it. And also in many of the questions, it's been made more clear that an answer needs to be given to these things with problems, even if they've been corrected. That we need to be disclosing past problems. So if my basement leaked and then I paid I hate to use trade names, but I'll do it, B-Dry Systems, $10,000 to waterproof my basement, I need to disclose that. I need to disclose that, yes, I did have leaks. Now it's been repaired, and no, it hasn't leaked since then. But whatever it is, whether it's been corrected or not, I need to disclose those things. And I will say, frankly, I consider that something that really is in the best interest of the seller anyway, because for a seller to, let's just pick on that leaky basement, for me to not disclose that my basement used to leak because I've had it fixed, for me to not disclose that it used to leak, I am making myself the guarantor of the repair company. That's what I'm doing. Because if I just say, no, it doesn't leak, well, I'm becoming the one who guarantees that it doesn't leak, and I don't want that. I want to say, it used to leak, ABC company fixed it, it hasn't leaked since then. And then if it turns around and leaks after ABC's job, 6 months after closing, I haven't misrepresented that to you. I told you exactly what the situation was with me, and maybe you can go back on ABC, maybe you can't, but it's not my problem. So I really do think that this is truly in the best interest of the seller that it's worded this way. Every section has a box at the end that says, please explain any deficiencies noted in this section. I probably put this in here more than once, I apologize, but I just thought it was very important that not only do you go along checking off yes and no's, but if you did have some kind of problem, you've got a little more space to actually write it, because some people have said, well, you didn't leave me enough room as a seller. I surely didn't think you meant me to write anymore. It's like, well, you were supposed to. Also, again, whether or not they've been corrected, state where there have been any problems. So that is consistently in all these questions. The old form, if you've ever taken a class from me, you know I complained that the old form sometimes said whether it had ever leaked, and some of them just said, does it do so now? And they were worded a little bit inconsistently, and now they've at least got them all worded the same way. Have you experienced or are you aware of water or drainage problems? What they've added here is the crawl space, because the question used to just say basement, right? But many, many houses, especially in the older parts of the city, have part basements, part crawl spaces. Some houses only have crawl spaces, and depending on how you interpreted that question, you could have been trying to be innocent and not answered it very thoroughly. So again, I think this is probably to the benefit of the seller that it's worded this way, that they can be more clear about what it is that's leaking. Again, if there's deficiencies, say so. Okay, the roof system. Has the roof leaked at any time before you owned or lived at the property? Again, would you know that? Maybe and maybe not. If you don't know, it's very clear that it's all to the best of your knowledge. But again, in many cases, we do know because of inspections, because sellers tell us, everything. Have I had repairs that involve placing shingles on the roof instead of replacing the entire roof covering? Again, if I remember right, the question used to be worded, have you ever had the roof repaired or something like that? And people got all snarled up over, well, does shingles count as opposed to the actual decking? And this may not be perfect, but I think it is an improvement on talking about shingles and decking in effect, to make them clear. You've got an opportunity to answer all those things. Okay, on the land and drainage questions, again, whether they've been corrected or not, are there problems? And state any deficiencies in those. So you've got an opportunity to make any kind of disclosure that you ought to be making. Sewer system, added the explain any deficiencies. The homeowners association provision, that's been there since 2016, if I remember right. But notice they specifically added some lines, and this is a safeguard for you. Is the property a condominium? If yes, you must complete Form 404. So That is clearly the law anyway. You, in fact, were required to be telling, or now required to be telling sellers and buyers about this condominium seller certificate. If you're using the seller's disclosure form, you're being covered on that. So this is in here to protect you and your buyer and seller clients. The Form 404, I just want to point out, it's almost identical, and that's this condominium seller certificate. It's almost identical to the old one, but it added a specific question about, are there any pet or rental restrictions? And that got put in there, and I'll take the blame or the credit for this from talking to the KREC, because in my experience representing condo and HOAs and their buyers and sellers, it was the two most common problems that we had in, other than just money, it was the two most common problems that people got into, and especially buyers who would buy them and they fully intended to rent them out, and they found out after the closing there was a rental restriction. Or they come in on closing day with their their 90-pound Great Dane, Fluffy, and the president comes over and says, hey, we got a 10-pound limit on animals in here. Fluffy's got to go. And obviously we're all really attached to our Fluffies in the world, and so that became a problem. So that's a standard question. It's certainly not the only question, but there are standard ones now printed in there. The seller's disclosure form, in addition to having the lead-based paint business in there, it also has added a radon disclosure requirement. This was specifically put in due to lobbying by the Kentucky chapter of the American Lung Association. And I will give credit to the Lung Association and your state trade association, the Kentucky Realtors. They negotiated quite a bit on the wording about this. And I will say that I'm sensitive to this matter. One of my parents died of lung cancer, so I am not dismissive of it, although it was certainly not from radon. I am not dismissive of lung cancer issues, but I will say that the language that they originally wanted was way too cumbersome, and you didn't want that. And your trade association did a good job of negotiating down this language to something that is, that's what needed to happen, and tell people if they want to inspect, they can, and let them know that. We've also got I had a typo, 396. A methamphetamine disclosure. I must have typed that. They didn't make that mistake. Requirement. That's been there since 2016. You've had that meth box in there. And also, again, I'll take the blame or the credit for this. There's been a question buried in the middle of miscellaneous for decades that said, do you know anything else about the property? And it was buried in the middle of the miscellaneous section. It was 10K for the longest time. And my problem with that is, by the time people were on the third page of this thing, they weren't reading very carefully, and they were skipping the question, both sellers and buyers, and it got moved to the very end. And so hopefully it truly should stick out like a sore thumb to everybody that I need to disclose it. If there wasn't some other question in here that covered this, now's my chance to come clean. If I'm a buyer, I need to pay attention to this question. So they moved it to the end. That question more or less was in there before, but it's been moved. And we are going to look at these forms. We've also got the seller-initiated listing form, which again is now regulatorily required. You've been using that for a long time. This is the cross the sign form that when a seller asked you to talk to them, even though they had a listing, they were allowed to talk to you. and we're going to take a quick look at the condominium disclosure form. All right, here's the next one. Make sure you're sitting down. I know you're at home and you're probably in a comfy chair. This is the regulatory review complaint process chart, okay? Is that wild? I invite you on your own time to try to figure that thing out. I have looked at it, and it's a pretty good job, but it is a convoluted process. The interesting thing is the KREC never had a flow chart before. They've only now had one. And let's see, we are gonna finish the slideshow, and then we're gonna go to the KREC site. But so this is the most important slide in the entire slideshow, though. Ready? Can I get a drum roll? And you know, however you do that on your table. This is really important. Aww, that's my granddaughter. Isn't she cute? That was in October. That was her Halloween costume. Of course, now she's a little older. Little Ruthie Roo. Okay, I don't know why I put that in there. Just because I could, I guess. It pays to be a grandpa. Okay, are we done? Well, we're almost done with the seminar, although we are gonna pull back and look at the KREC forms real quick. But more importantly, what I meant by this is, are we done with the changes? No, we're not done. At a minimum, we're going to see new agency disclosure forms hopefully in 2020. Maybe I was too optimistic when I put that date in there. But you're probably good for a while now with this regulation update. But know that the KREC meets every month, and they're always up to something that affects your license. So when we leave this slideshow and go over to their website, I'm going to show you where you can look at their minutes. Let's do that first, and then we're going to look at the forms, okay? So I'm going to stop sharing this PowerPoint, and bink, there we go. And I'm going to close down the PowerPoint. Okay, and now, if I've done this right, oh, I did. I love it. Let me go to screen share again, and I'm going to pull up, first of all, there we go. This is the KREC, I don't want to lose you. This is the Form 201 that we've talked about so many times, and I just wanted you to see it about your information. It is, by the way, a PDF fillable form, so I could put, you know, I could say I can't type, but I can spell. There we go. I could put Denny in there as my alternate or assumed name, or actually that would have been my nickname, wouldn't it? Denny's Sales would have been my nickname, I guess, if I was going to have one. And so you can self-fill this form, and here's where you get new nicknames, where you have a new name, alternate names. They even tell you what your fee is in case you forget. So this is a many-purposed form about names, addresses, alternate names, team names that you may need, is this Form 201. All right, I'm going to stop sharing that for just a second. And, uh-oh, there you are. Okay. And then, here we go. We're going to screen share the KREC. This is the page, the way it looks. As soon as you log in and click on forms anyway, this is how the KREC page looks. And, oh boy, that's what I get. Come on. Unbelievable. Hang on. I gotta go get my, I gotta open up their webpage. Give me a second here. Probably logged me out for being on there too long. I did not happy. Okay, it's not going to do it. All right, I've got something else right here. There it comes. Okay, that'll work. I've got, fortunately, on my desktop, here we go. Here we go, the condo seller certificate form. Now, this one is also given a new KREC form 404. So just so you know, you can go pull it up. And it's very similar to the other one that you've had since 2011. But here you do have these two questions about pet restrictions and rental restrictions. I also just want to remind you that the most important parts about the condo disclosure form are buried down here in the attachments. So, you know, the form does a good job of what it does, but then you really do have to dig into the actual documents to get to the meat of the coconut in many cases.
Dennis, did you say the pet and rental restrictions, that's part of 404 or the new seller disclosure?
Great question. It's part of 404, the condo disclosure form. Now, the pet question is still in the seller's disclosure form. So that question is still there, but the condo form 404 has the specific question about, are there restrictions with the, excuse me, with the association about pets and rentals. And here we go. Okay, here we go. Well, thank goodness. I think the KREC website is mad at me. Apparently I've used it too much today or something. It's not letting me on there, but I'd already saved these. Here we go. I'd already saved these forms on my desktop. So here we are screen sharing those. So here's the 404 again. So these aren't really in any particular order. Here's the seller initiated listing form. So this is the, you can cross the sign form. So very similar to the old one. What do they call this? This is a form 403. I've probably got them in here backwards. Okay, and here's the new seller's disclosure of property condition form. So that's the 402. You'll note, and so this is the one you've got to start using Sunday night. You'll notice that there's lots of words on here. I highlighted in this PowerPoint the ones that were truly new and different. Notice that here's this business about, have you lived in the house? When did you buy it? Has it been used as a rental? Was it vacant for more than 3 consecutive months? Has it been used as anything other than a residence? Those are the biggest new questions. I did want to get down here to, here's where they ask about the condominium. Whoop, highlighted the whole thing. Okay, there's the condominium question. Here's the radon disclosure statement. I want to take a look at that here. This is buried in 11. So, are you aware of any testing for radon gas? If yes, what were the results? Is there a radon mitigation system installed? If yes, is it functioning properly? And again, that's always, of course, to the best of your knowledge. And they've told us that radon is a naturally occurring gas, blah, 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 health risk, including cancer. So that's all in here, and we've got these new specific radon questions. We've also got these meth. Now that meth box has been around for a while. And also the question is it currently contaminated, and has it been professionally decontaminated? And that's a little more specific, if you remember, than the old questions that were a little sloppy about that. So they tightened up the questions. And then I want you to see way back here, here's my 13. Whoops, sorry, it's not letting me highlight just a word. Do you know anything else about the property that should be disclosed to the buyer? That's in 13. And then we've got the usual signatures and whatnot. Here's the guide to agency relationships. Again, this is the form you do not have to use. You can keep using your consumer guide that you've already got. Here's the agency consent agreement for the seller, and the one for the buyer is virtually identical. And again, the problems with it were, I'm going to start with the seller form. Remember, the regulation said you were supposed to get this filled out at the time of the listing. Now, at the time of the listing, you really can't fill this thing out. You can't do it. It's not a matter of, you know, can you monkey it around? You would have to butcher the thing so bad it would be unrecognizable to use it, and that has to get fixed. And then here was the other problem is, I'm down here, if there's only one real estate agent involved, you had the choice of checking only the seller, only the buyer, or neither. But if you represented neither, then you were really a transaction broker, and that's what Part 4 is about. So they needed to get rid of the neither because it was just going to lead to total chaos. So those are the reasons those are the minimum reasons that the forms have to be changed. But so keep using the agency disclosure you've got, and you'll be okay. And those are the forms that we needed to cover. I think the KREC, I got to say, I know at times I've probably sounded critical of them, but I really do think they did a good job in getting a lot of changes made to these regulations to make them much more consistent with the way you really practice, fixing all those triggers that were impossible to comply with, making good improvements to the forms. And so again, I want to commend them for, frankly, it was a task nobody else was ever brave enough to tackle, is go back in and read every word again and try to figure it out. Nobody else was ever even willing to do that.